and in this case, of course, especially about the Second World War and the persecution of the Jews especially. And Bob Moore has a great knowledge of these topics and a great experience in research, also in the Netherlands and in Dutch archives, but in many archives in Western European countries. And therefore I think he's a very interesting guest to discuss with you. You can discuss his work, perhaps. You know, the two important books in this case are, of course, his last book about the survivors, about rescue, which will also be the main topic, I suppose, of the lecture this afternoon. But before that, there was a more general book about the persecution of the Jews in the Netherlands. Survivors, victims and survivors was the title, if I remember well. And there are many other topics Bob wrote about: prisoners of war, rescue, resistance, and so on. So I hope it will be interesting for you to ask some questions. You can ask questions that are connected with your own research. And if some of you would like to ask your question in Dutch, you're welcome to do it, because Bob understands Dutch very well. To begin with, I give the floor to Inger Schaap, who is a former MA student of ours and has now a very important position as the president of the alumni organization, or club, or union, how do you call it? And I give you the floor because you have some remarks or things to say. Welcome.
Yes. Well, thank you. Well, allow me a few minutes, maybe seconds even, to tell a little bit about our circle of alumni. I've been thinking about a translation for our alumni kring, but I think circle of alumni is the best way to put it. We have started a few years ago with this circle because, as you know, the master program hasn't been here for such a long time, but we find it very important to stay in touch with all the students who are now studying Holocaust and Genocide Studies, or even the Keuzevak now in the second year of your university study. And we like to keep in touch to hear about your career, about where you go after your masters, and to exchange experience and views, etc. So I want to take profit of this moment to announce a little bit, to announce our following activities, because 3 times a year we organize something for the students of the master program and for our alumni. So the first activity after this very special moment, and we're very honored that you agreed to talk to us in this informal setting. But on the 3rd of November, it's the annual AUV Dag, and we are happy that Oor, who is also present in the back of our room, will give a lecture then about the situation in Syria and how you can analyze a present-day conflict with the knowledge of Holocaust and Genocide Studies. So I would like to invite you to attend that lecture on the 3rd of November, on Saturday. Then we are in the middle of organizing what we call a film marathon, because, as you've probably heard of, Claude Lanzmann made a movie, Show Up, that takes 9 hours, and I'm sure everyone thought, I have to see this once, so we offer you the opportunity to do that together, and we are organizing a marathon. But please stay in touch with us, check our Facebook regularly for our activities. Then, as Richard announced, we have a board of the alumni group, and we have been with the same group for a few years now, and we are open to invite new board members. So if you are now a master student, or maybe you're an alumnus, please consider this if you want to be part of our board. Okay, well, thank you for allowing me a few minutes of your time, but we are here,
commercial.
For this commercial talk.
Start with commercial like we are used to.
But of course, today you're in the middle of our attention, so if you allow me, I would like to start by asking you first question about your work. I'm doing research myself about the role of bystanders, about civilian aid to the prisoners of the former concentration camp Vught in the Netherlands. And so I'm very interested in your work, of course. My question about your book is as follows. You're almost accused of humanizing the rescuer. In the past 10 years or so, the idea of humanizing the perpetrator has become a major issue in the historical debate. But in one of the book reviews, I found this sentence that you make the rescuers real persons. So you are humanizing the rescuer. Now my question is, don't we need our heroes anymore? Are we in a post-hero era? Can you maybe tell a little bit about the examples that you use in your work? And
okay, let's start with easy questions first. First of all, can I say thank you all for being here this morning. It's a delight to see so many people here, and a delight to see that the subject matter of the Holocaust in its wider context has still retained such an interest in students in the Netherlands. It certainly does in the UK as well, and it's very rewarding to see so many people coming to listen to me, because I don't think I'm worth listening to, but we'll see. And also to greet my former colleague, sitting in the corner there. Morning, sir. Nice to see you looking so well. He will keep me honest this morning, because I'll expect interruptions from the back. I think one of the issues that struck me when I was looking at this whole topic was the fact that there was this enormously heroic element attached to the role of individuals. And it's been reinforced by the way in which Yad Vashem has done its own researches and the way in which that has then been published in these big encyclopedias in other ways. One shouldn't ever undermine or underestimate the level of risk, the level of heroism that individuals put into this, often without any outside support at all. Something I'm going to talk about this afternoon, albeit very briefly. What drew me into this was the idea of, in 1942, when an individual or a family said to a Jewish person or persons they knew, we will look after you, we will shelter you, they were taking on a completely open-ended commitment. The Germans are winning on all fronts. There is no chance of any amelioration of what had happened, of the occupation in the short or in the medium term. Did they really know what they were taking on? Could they possibly think their way through, logically, through that type of scenario? And the answer is no. Yet they did it anyway. And they were putting not only themselves, but potentially their families at risk as well in so doing. Now, there's been a big debate about exactly what the penalties were for this type of activity and whether they were actually ever carried out. And that varies by time and place, and it's a problem for the Netherlands, also a problem elsewhere in Europe in trying to assess that. But getting back into the minds of what people actually knew about the risks they were taking at the moment they took them is quite difficult. But I don't want to be in a position of saying, we can sort of, in a sense, historicise all this behaviour pattern. We can't. And when we try to look for patterns of behaviour, we run into all sorts of problems. And it's a problem of the selection of sources and the selection of individual examples to put into a work. Now, Vika very kindly done the commercial for my book. But when I'd finished writing that book, it ran to about 220,000 words. Because I decided just to write it, not worry too much about what the publishers said about word limits. Publishers will always have word limits. Journal editors always have word limits. But sometimes it's better just to write it and say, okay, let's get it down on paper first, and then worry about editing it down afterwards. The contract was for 150,000 words. So it meant that about 70,000 words came out of the original text. So having introduced all these examples, which I'd carefully got out of the archives here and elsewhere in Europe, then thinking, I'm going to have to dispose of some of these. Which ones do I leave in? The choices I then make, somehow or other, alter the way, the nuancing of the arguments. Which ones do I keep? Which ones do I take out? Do I just shorten? Sometimes you'll get a text which you think is absolutely vital to your view. But can I shorten it? And if I shorten it, does it alter its meaning? I'm sorry, I'm getting into the technicalities of actually
Kill
producing
your
a text.
darlings.
But it's like killing your children. You know, which ones do you dispose? Having spent all this time finding those information, how do you go about then contracting it down? So humanising rescuers is all very well. And those stories are there to be told. But the problem with that is there are plenty of stories published and either on the web or in written form about individual rescuers. But their stories are sometimes used for other purposes. They are used to highlight the philanthropy of a particular religious group or a particular set of religious beliefs. And there's been a lot of publications, especially coming out of the United States, that have done just that. And one has to be a little bit wary about these sources, about exactly where they've come from, and their provenance, if you like, where they've appeared from. And so I suppose I was trying to work against that line of having a hero of the month. Sorry, that's taking NIOD website a bit too seriously, but it's that idea of thinking in my mind, these aren't just ordinary people, but they are in some cases doing extraordinary things. And what I haven't done, certainly not done in this book, but perhaps it's quite important, is to think, well, there may be other examples, completely divorced from the Holocaust or from the Overvocken, where similar acts take place. Now, acts of resistance are an obvious example, in the wider context, an obvious example of that. And you look at the early history of Verzet in Netherlands, and you look at people taking action directly against the German occupiers. Why do they do this? There's no chance of anybody coming in to save them in the short term, but they're cutting phone lines and doing so. It's the same types of behaviour, but in different formats. And there is a potentially a comparative that one could look at in those terms. Well, of the idea of the heroic is not confined to rescuing Jews or indeed to attacking Germans, but can have different positions, different places. And at that point, I'm going to back out of that question. This bit, and so you can leave it at that.
Thank you very much. To someone who wants to continue this conversation, or quite another, you spoke about that you were looking for patterns of help of Jews rescue, and as a contrast to this Yad Vashem approach. And do you have the feeling? May I ask you have succeeded in finding patterns?
No, that's the punchline to the lecture this afternoon. There aren't any.
Okay.
It's very difficult. The idea behind the wider comparative was to try and look at different countries. I mean, I know other people have done this too. Hans Blomby years ago in this survey work. And one of the things that got me into this, I ended up translating the Dutch text into English for its publication in English, and got enthused by the whole idea of it from that. It is very difficult to make those patterns up, but I suppose that the counterpoint to the Yad Vashem approach of individuals, always individuals, there's only one group of people who have been honoured by Yad Vashem, and that's the Danish resistance, collectively. As far unless you know differently, but I think that's right. What it tends to play down is the degree to which people then organise the whole concept of the resistance network, if you like, or the sheltering network. And they come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes. There is currently, I was talking to somebody the other day who is very keen to try and have the Quakers recognised as being righteous among the nations. It's going to be a very difficult thing to do. Not least because of the criteria that Yad Vashem now use for the purposes of making that award. But also because the Quakers, and I'm quite interested in them as a group anyway, did lots of wonderful things during the occupation to help Jews and others, has to be said. But in some cases, peculiarly Jews, and that's what makes them candidates for Yad Vashem. But of course their religious beliefs are vested in the ideas of helping those in need, and specifically those imprisoned. So of course in 1945, the first thing they do is start prison visiting ex-Nazis who are locked up in camps. They shift their charitable impulses away from those people who the Nazis have locked up to the Nazis who are now locked up by the post-war generation. And that's how people tend to look at that and go, hang on a second, that can't be right. You know, they're shifting their allegiance to the bad guys now, and that sort of colours the world's view of what they were doing. So I think there's a problem with that too. But I think one of the things was to try and get away from Yad Vashem and the individual towards the idea of saying it's not all about individual. These people work in concert one with another. Classic examples that play very little role in this book, but are mentioned at least, are the student networks that were set up to shelter Jewish children in Holland, for example. They're unique. You don't get that student activism anywhere else in Western Europe, as far as I can see. But of course, in other countries in Western Europe, it wasn't necessary because there were other people doing that work already. You know, so they come in to fill a gap. But that idea of people working and how that then functions. Another example of the type of thing I'm talking about, as you'll be well aware because you've studied the topic probably in more detail than I have in some cases. There are plenty of examples in the northeastern Netherlands of some villages and towns where a large number of Jews were sheltered, and others next door, 2 or 3 miles away, where nothing happens at all. How do you explain that sociologically? You don't. You explain it through the networks that were created that allowed a particular pastor or predikant or whatever to mobilise his flock, his parishioners, into some sort of activism on that particular issue. That may be linked back to Amsterdam or to where the people are coming from in the first place. You get the same type of patterns in Belgium, where you get individual activists who are responsible for creating these networks, and what appear to be completely random patterns. The students I spoke about earlier, who did they talk to? They involved their families, so the families who lived somewhere out in the middle of nowhere. So, can you take a couple of children? Yes, of course we can. Then they talk to their friends, and it expands out from there. Nobody, as far as I know, has really looked to try and chart the way in which one of those networks operate at ground level, to see where the linkages were made and how it operated geographically, but also in terms of the individual linkages. I call them, I think, in sort of networks of trust. When you're in trouble, who do you go to? Who do you talk to? Who can you trust to do this? Well, with priests, it's people they study with at the seminary. With doctors, it's people they study with the university students. They know the strengths and weaknesses of the people I'm looking around the room, the strengths and weaknesses of the people they studied with, who they would trust with secrets and so on and so forth. And you get those sort of patterns. And that's a common pattern, irrespective of country. You know, you can see the same thing happening in Norway, limitedly in Denmark because of the timescale, but also in Belgium and France as well. So I think it's more a question of trying to balance up a whole series of issues that come out of this in different formats. The one thing I would say, and I'll just touch about this some this afternoon as well, sociologists, of course, have used this type of material for different purposes again, to look at aspects of human behaviour. I've got issues with the way in which it's been done, simply on the grounds that there's almost self-fulfilling prophecies, but if anybody wants to take me on that, that's fine.
Thank you. Nancy.
Hi, Nancy. Sorry
for sitting behind.
No,
maybe you could tell us a little bit about the methodology and your approach to the sources, because as you're reconstructing these personal histories, there's always the question of, well, who are you using as sources? I have to admit I haven't yet read the book, so I haven't been able to look into this, but sometimes we change the story a bit about how things work. We remember things differently. Other people remember things differently. Memoirs reflect different truths, and it's very complex. And I was thinking about that when you were saying about all the 70,000 words that you threw out, and I'm sure that you had to use a lot of those to describe some of these issues.
I think it's a very important issue. Don't get me wrong, and I think to some extent, certainly with a big comparative text like that, you have to trust the author. I don't look very trustworthy, but you have to trust that they're trying to do it honestly. But when
I must have been a skeptic about you. I was talking about the sources.
I think it's perfectly real. I think you should go into it. There is a famous British interviewer called Jeremy Paxman who does interviews of politicians late in some of you might have heard of him. And he's explained this to me. He said when he interviews politicians, his first thought is, Why is this bastard lying to me? He starts from that perspective. You need to be sceptical too about the sources that you use, the provenance of the sources you use. That's part of your job as a historian, to be able to look at this and say, can we really trust what we're seeing here? As a historian, I think you build up a sense of being able to trust particular sources. If you know where they come from, you know how they've been collected. Some of the best sources for how the Jews had been sheltered, insofar as they had been sheltered, and some fairly honest testimonies came out of the very early work of NIOD, as it then was. Those first, I like to think, were the first embedded historians who were collecting material, even at the end of 1944 in the southern Netherlands, and collecting some information about all aspects of resistance, but also alongside that, stuff from the Landelijke Organisatie, and there are files downstairs in the basement here. Very factual. This is what we did. This is when we did it. These were the problems, and some are absolutely wonderful sources, very contemporary sources about what goes on. If you take the other extreme of that, and you start to look at the survivors, people who had survived underground during the occupation period, then it starts to become more problematic. And it gets more and more problematic the further away you get from that 1945 tipping point, if you like. The Fortunov Archive, to name but one at Yale, has 4,000 videoed survivor testimonies. It would take you forever to go through them all. Chris Browning has done, I think, a reasonable job with the Strakovice labour camp, forced labour camp, which was a place which didn't appear to have any survivors much, but he managed to find 156 people who had been through that camp with testimonies. Well, I remember because I was in Washington with him in 2003 when he was going through them, and reading all. But what came out of his work, and it's one of the very important things that came out of that, was that he made the case, and one of the very few people who could say this, to say you had to exact the same tests on this type of survivor testimony as you would on any other historical. You cannot give it some privileged position because it's contradictory. The accounts won't be the same. They will be completely, you'll have chalk and cheese, you'll have completely different things coming across. You have to apply the same tests. What I discovered in listening and reading some testimonies recorded in that way was that, to a large extent, it depends on the interview. If the interviewers are complete idiots or don't know anything, they're going to ask banal questions which will frustrate the subject of the interview or produce banal answers, or answers that don't make any sense. It's very important in that context to have testimonies where the interviewers know what they're talking about, or at least are able to ask the right questions. But that goes directly to the whole question of oral sources and how they are best collected. And of course we don't have control of that unless you do it yourself. And we're at a stage now where that's virtually impossible for the period that we talk about. You have to rely on what's there, but then you have to be very sceptical about what you're looking at. But in the end, to come back to Nancy's original question, it's about selection. It's about choosing the sources that you think best sum up the generality of what you found across a range, possibly a range of bits and pieces. Sometimes, if you're really unlucky, you've only got one, in which case you have to use it and maybe qualify.
You generalise.
Yeah, and you can build a whole castle out of one phrase or saying, which is very dangerous. But with all these things, you have to be honest about it and say what it is you're doing. Say, well, there's not a lot around to use here. However, this looks, on the face of it, to be the best way of trying to describe it. And I have a natural penchant, call it what you will, for the idea of trying, wherever it's possible, to let the sources speak for themselves. And maybe sometimes not drawing too many conclusions, just leaving it out and saying to people, okay, draw your own conclusions about it. How does this work? Here's somebody who was there at the time. How do we go about, interpreting this? Well, make up your own mind about it. That's what you would do with undergraduate students anyway. One would trust, but
this is really important advice to all of you.
But the other case that coming a bit close to home, Arnold Douglas, who was a network organiser in Drenthe in 1943 and 44, did one thing that most illegal workers should never do. He kept a contemporary diary, Surprising how many people did that, in spite of the dangers associated with it. There were lots of Belgian priests who did it as well. Then when things got really desperate, buried it. But it was later sort of looked at again. There's a copy of the original text, typed out text downstairs. But if you then read his rethought diary, which came out about 30 years later, again it's contradictory, and it goes to the point that we made earlier on here. Over time, people's perception of what they did change. It gets changed by them being told other things they couldn't possibly know at the time. So again, the further away the sources get from the events, the more qualifications you have to build into what you're saying about the material that you're using. But that's part of the historian's trade. Listening and nodding, Nancy. But we've all seen it. It doesn't matter what you're working on. You'd apply that just the same to 12th century Brabant as you would do to 20th century Netherlands or France or Belgium.
Thank you.
I'm sure many of you have your own thoughts and your own interest, for which could be interesting to have ask a question to Professor Moore. Well, it's always at the beginning, it's very quiet, and then at the end, when the hour is over, then everybody has a lot of questions.
I've got nowhere to go, you can spend some time doing this.
Barbara.
I know that you studied many subjects and you published on broader subjects than just
You're very
this book
kind, yeah.
and internationally as well. But I was wondering, how come that you decided to study Dutch history and learn Dutch language?
I've never learned the Dutch language.
Because of the sources you
Yeah,
came
no,
across?
it's not. It's a story that ought to be perhaps better known than it should be. My mother's Dutch,
Okay.
and I spent 13 summers living in Hoenderloo in Veluwe. I have never.
Still doesn't explain all of it. But
Okay.
Yeah.
How do you get into this? It's you might as well have the whole story then. My grandmother died when I was 13, so that stopped. After that, I never came back to the Netherlands. So any Dutch that I learnt was purely from my cousins and from day-to-day sort of talking to my grandparents originally, and later on my grandmother. When I went to university, I still retained some vague knowledge of Dutch, and in our final year as undergraduates, we were required to write a dissertation. And my supervisor for that year said, "Oh, you know a bit about the Netherlands, don't you? There are some sources in the Wiener Library in London which you might want to go and have a look at," and base a dissertation on that. And it turned out to be material about which had migrated from Amsterdam to London and not been sent back from the Comité voor Joodse Vluchtelingen. So I wrote an undergraduate dissertation on refugee work in Amsterdam in the 1930s. That later became a PhD topic. And that's the point when I pitched up here. I was saying to Wiechert, so long ago, it's almost incredible, 1979, it was in a different building, when Lou de Jong, I think, might have just retired by that stage, but it must have been close. But it was a very different operation than the one it is now, I would have to say. And most of the archives I wanted to use weren't here at all, but in what was then called the Indische Afdeling, which was way out, sort of beyond the Overtons on the south of Amsterdam. Yeah. And I spent 12 weeks commuting in and out to this other building where, for some obscure reason, material on refugees was held alongside all the stuff on Indonesia. But it was a great way to do it.
And the Netherlands Uni too.
No,
we could have met.
We could have met, yeah. So that's sort of idea. So that's how it began. As then later on a historian with a career in England, one of the reasons why I published quite widely on Dutch topics is because I was one of the very few people they could ask to review books in Dutch, to write on Dutch topics. I've just been asked to write something on the Dutch colonies in the First World War, and I'm thinking, what do I know about that? I know there are plenty of good texts out there for various reasons, but you tend to get those commissions. But that, in a sense, I want to reverse that and say that one of the things that a lot of those works were about was to try to make Dutch history, which has always been very parochial in its outlook, more accessible to the Anglophone world. In other words, what I'm doing is synthesising what's already out there in Dutch and making it accessible to a wider public. And that's okay. That may sound a bit pretentious, but it does have its advantages, because what I then say about the Netherlands, especially in things like victims and survivors, then goes into all the texts which are written by scholars who maybe know more about Eastern Europe or something, and make then comparative judgments about what's going on. And then they write back to me 20 years later and say, where did you find this, or where did you find that? No idea. I'm up in the attic trying to find the paperwork to try and work out where it came from. It happened to me last week, in fact. Bernard Wasserstein, who some of you may have come across, who was here a couple of weeks back, he was certainly in Amsterdam, and said, in your book you say that Zut, the German functionary who was part of the Overwogen here, was in Amsterdam in March, and Gertrude van Tijn, of whom he's writing a biography, says that she met him in April. But his records in Berlin say he wasn't transferred here until June. What are your sources for this? So I wrote back, so I looked it up and wrote back saying, well, I was trusting Lou de Jong on that one, because on page 969 of volume 5, that's where it says he was in there in March. But of course, therein lies the problem. And this, I suppose it's a critique of major work. There are no footnotes. Now, how on earth do you trace it? Sometimes you find the stuff by accident. You think, oh, that's where you got it from. It's in some files. But tracing that back. Now, in the Anglophone world, that looks like very bad academic practice, and will probably seem such to most of us sitting around the table now, where we reference everything that we do. But of course, once you go back in time, I'm borrowing stuff from Lou de Jong, and he borrowed it from somebody else, and so on and so forth. But sometimes, to track that back now, Wasserstein, as far as I know, doesn't speak Dutch. I'm sure there's a way of tracking that back, and there's probably stuff that Zerp signed downstairs in the archive somewhere on specific dates. Maybe, but it would take a long time to find it. But you do get interrogated and all sorts of stuff. Had another one recently of a Canadian scholar who wrote to me and said, there's a file you looked at in your PhD thesis, which, when I looked, it was still in the Ministerie van Justitie. It's now gone to Algemeen Rijksarchief. He said, but they've lost it. Have you got any copies? Have you got any notes? And I looked through, any notes on that. Although in those days, when I worked there was a semi-statisch archive in the Ministerie van Justitie. I walked in there, and I was still quite unusual. An Englishman coming to work in a Dutch ministerial archive was a bit odd in the late 1970s. And so they were quite intrigued by what I was doing. And I said to them, is there any possibility of photocopying any of the archives? And they produced their photocopying statute from 1959, where it cost you a guilder for each copy, but it was intended to be photographed. You had to fill in 3 forms. And they said, we don't want to do the paperwork. The photocopy's over there, just help yourself. I thought how wonderfully liberal that was for the Ministry of Justice to do that. But sometimes you get away with stuff. And I would also say, and this has got nothing to do with anything we've discussed now, and at the risk of any archivists being in the room, that finding material now in archives is a whole lot easier than it once was. Archivists now work with you, not against you, because they are publicly accountable to money more often than not. But in the past, it was almost impossible to get stuff out of archives.
Depends on where.
Yeah, I'm ruling out Eastern Europe because I know it hasn't changed there. But certainly in Western Europe, it's a lot easier now to do it than it once was. So make the most of it while it lasts, because it may not last forever.
Well, even in the old NIOD, they had a tendency, no, this is not interesting for you, so we don't give it.
When I arrived here in 1979 and told them what I was doing, they said, why are you doing that? It's all in de Jong, you don't need to bother.
Yeah.
So, that's true now as it was then.
Are there any more questions?
Go.
Can you say something about your views on the state of Holocaust studies in Britain? Sometimes from Americans I hear some pessimistic voices, like there's interest is declining and support is declining. What is the situation in England?
There are a relatively small number of what you might call active scholars in that area. You probably name on the fingers of 2 hands, I would imagine, in terms of scholarship. And I think in part that's because, well, there's just 2 reasons. One, because the Holocaust is at one remove from the UK system. In other words, although the United Kingdom will try and claim some affinity with the Holocaust, in fact it doesn't touch it at all, except in some very obscure ways. Yes, there are survivors who live in the United Kingdom. Yes, there are some debates about what the British government might or might not have done to have ameliorated the problem. But that's about the limit of it. It's not a topic that necessarily generates a huge amount of scholastic activity, and there are good reasons for that. Because the UK system, given the way it works, doesn't produce the people who can do the languages. And as a result, the number of scholars who work in that area are relatively small. Even smaller that work on topics like Nancy and you work on in terms of Eastern Europe. Because of that, in a sense, I would, begging your pardons, I think that's where, in the light of new archival material, that's where the focus of Holocaust studies has gone. It's moved to the Eastern European context. Quite rightly so too, I think, no question of that. But we don't have the scholarly base in Britain to be able to sustain that. At a different level, the topic as a subject for undergraduate and to some extent for master's study remains very important. I'm never short of students to teach. But, for the most part, they're monoglots. So once you get beyond the initial phases of the study, which you can do from secondary sources in the English language, then they become stuck. So unless they then go off and learn other languages, they're not going to get much further with it long terms. And that's a function of the way the whole situation is. It's from that position, it's not that good. It's also a question of saying, okay, what topics would one research in that context? It takes a fair commitment to learn another language from scratch in order to go off and research a topic in a culture in a country that one has. And I know I'm looking at people who've done exactly that, but it's not a commonplace. And I think although the British state has adopted the Holocaust, so we now have a Holocaust Memorial Day, and I do try and avoid these things, and basically I can't see the relevance to it to British culture to any great degree. It's an outside abstraction, if you like, but it retains its draw for students, certainly, but they can only take it so far. And I think the advantage with students in Holland and other countries have is your educational upbringing and your access to other languages makes that a good deal more viable for what you do than many of your contemporaries in the UK.
Certainly one of the difficulties in doing original studies, historical studies, and not knowing the languages of the countries you're studying. And we very often have this in discussion with students that will go to a country and do not know or only partly the language. And well, then doing real research is a problem.
There's a very steep learning curve at certain true.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. My question is, in my research I came across many rescuers or civilians who are willing to aid people, but Dutch, non-Jews. Have you come across this as well? Like, can you explain about the willingness of people in the Dutch case I'm talking about now to help non-Jews rather than Jews? Can you... I'm sorry about that.
No, it's a legitimate question in the sense that people make choices. They make choices about who they wish to help.
Yeah, if you consider people in hiding and such, like in the Netherlands, there were many more non-Jews in hiding.
Sure, yeah. And there are some people who are prepared to help POWs on the run, but not civilians. Because I think some people who have fought for their country, that's fair enough, and so on. So they make distinctions. I'll give you a different example of actually two examples, both of which from one of somebody who sheltered Jews in his house, but who was anti-Semitic. But he balanced it out by saying he was more anti-German than he was anti-Semitic, so he was prepared. Anything to do something against the Germans, that was fine. Conversely, there was another case I came across. He said, he was given this man to look after and keep in his house, and said, after a couple of weeks, I can't stand him. I don't care he's Jewish, but he's German. I can't stand Germans. Wanted him out because he was a German Jew rather than a Dutch Jew. So you get all those nuances of behaviour. I mean, I don't think it's possible to deconstruct it, but people have, if you like, they will have their own moral map about, insofar as they have choices. And let me come back to that in a minute. But they have a moral map about who they think is worthy of being helped and those that are not. There are a lot of distinctions made within the terms of the Holocaust in the Netherlands between children and adults, but that's not peculiar to the Netherlands. It happens in Belgium, it happens in France too. Children are considered to be innocent, whereas adults have made choices. I'm not going to justify that. That's just the way it's framed out. But the other thing that struck me, it struck me. I gave a talk in somewhere in the United States, where somebody rounded on me and said, "Well, you know, it's all about national characteristics. You know, some nationalities will act in one way and some in another." And I thought this is crude. This is crude in the extreme. And it quite right it is. But in a lot of cases, it's not so much trying to question why people behaved as they did, but what opportunities were they given? Because in the context of the way in which rescue appears to work in the Netherlands to a large extent, it's not necessarily down saying, "Oh, today I'll go out and rescue some Jews." You know, somebody's got to offer this up as a possibility. So there are probably a lot of people who were never asked and never had any contact with it. You can't go out, you can't put adverts in the newspaper. Or if you start talking about saying, "Wouldn't it be a good idea to do X or Y?" Who are you talking to? You can't sort of offer yourself up unless you are very sure of the people you're talking to. So I expect there are a lot of people who never, for example, were asked to help Jews, but they might have been more likely to have helped non-Jews underdaggers of various sorts.
They say it's more about the opportunity. And
opportunity has to be built in. And okay, this comes back to this piece of family history, come back to Barbara's original question. Because I asked my mother this question. They lived in a small holding in Hundela, which is, probably some of you know, is right in the middle of nowhere, and was even more in the middle of nowhere in 1944. They had a fair number of pilots and then paratroopers from Ireland who came through their house being whisked away northwards. And I said, "Well, did you never have any contact with any Jews on the run?" And she said, "Not directly. She had seen, because she was in the village she wasn't working during the war, but she had seen people who looked Jewish going to the pastorie in the village. And this is often the case, that Jews on the run, without help, would often go to the local church to go and talk to the priest or the pastoral. But although they were connected to the church, as most people were in their villages, they were never asked to do anything. And as a result, because they were working in another network already, never went out of their way to go looking for more people. Now, how do you evaluate that? I mean, it's quite difficult to do that. If you're already working in one sphere, do you then start doing something else as well? Because, of course, the dangers of mixing those networks, that means they'd be betrayed by two quarters, not just by one, with huge damage attached to it. Now, that maybe is a post-facto rationalisation, but I suspect that's quite commonplace. But can you generalise? Probably not, I suspect. It's difficult to see. You have to see it in terms of networks and what people were exposed to and that's to. One thing I would just, if I may, just at the end of this, one of the things that struck me about it was that some of the very early escape lines and networks were created before the Jews were really sought after in the way that we talk about now after the summer of 1942. And they pre-existed to help politicals and prisoners of war. Some decided to mix up their activities and did something of everything. Others remained specific. There seems in Holland to be a more divided view of this. In other words, if you're moving pilots around, you don't touch Jews as well. Landorganisatie had that make those distinctions as well. In Belgium and in France, you tend to get a greater degree of homogenisation of the two things. You know, of networks operating to help just about anybody on the run. Sometimes for money, sometimes that human, and that brings in a whole other set of values.
I think Lard also had a question first.
Yeah.
Okay. You were talking about patterns before, and as a Jewish guy, I would like to ask you, do you see any specific pattern during the Holocaust, during the Holocaust, where Jews rescue other Jewish people, and didn't appear in other genocidal events?
I think it's what you've hit on is one of the things that is often ignored. And I'm going to, again, those of you who come to the lecture this afternoon, I'm going to make a big point about this, about the idea that somehow we have this compartmentalisation. There are rescuers and there are Jews. And Jews are just sort of there as passive recipients of rescue. It doesn't work like that. That's a pattern which, if you only studied the Netherlands, you could make work a good deal better than, say, if you went to Belgium or to France. And one of the things I'm going to argue this afternoon, at the risk of this video going viral before 3:30, is that you have to look at it in terms of the idea of Jewish self-help alongside the role of rescuers and rescue networks. And it's where those two things come together where the greatest successes lie. So that's the first thing I would say. Other genocides. I'm turning to my colleague Uongo there, who will also get an honourable mention this afternoon at some point in relation to the Ottoman Empire. But I think there is a lot to be done in this context about taking the ideas about rescuing and rescuing behaviour and all, saving people from state tyranny and all that, saying, actually, it's not about World War II at all. It's not about the German occupation. On my way to the United States some years ago, I was given a novel by a friend of mine to read on the plane, 8 hours on the plane, you need something to... And it was a novel about two British soldiers who had found themselves on the wrong side of the Western Front in 1915 and had been sheltered in a village on the German side line for about 2.5 years. And a light bulb came on in my mind and thought, hang on, sheltering, it's not a peculiarly World War II thing, it's something that goes on in other contexts. You know, in this case, World War I. And then you start to see the linkages between the two. Another case in point, some of the main actors, rescuing actors in Liège, for example, had track records as resistors in the First World War. So you start to think it's not all about the specifics of 40 to 45. It may be a caesura, it may be something to be studied in isolation, but the behaviours don't, and they transcend. That you can look back probably to the medieval period and find similar forms of behaviour. I would also argue you can see it happening subsequently as well. And I think from that perspective, but we're now moving into areas where I think there has to be a lot more work done on this type of issue. But it's also you can also relativise it. I mean, at what point do you take somebody into your home who may be being sought by the authorities, not necessarily so they can be deported and shot or gassed, but who would face an uncertain future if they were found? Because every country, even in Western Europe, has large numbers of people in that situation. And by some logic, they must be being sheltered by somebody. And I've now constructed a huge conspiracy theory which I cannot justify. But to take up your point, I think that's, if you like, that's where, if you wanted to take rescue beyond its World War II boundaries, I think that's where it's going to go comparatively. You know, in other words, volumes 3, 4 and 5 of this might, not that I'm going to write them, but that it might actually move in that direction. So, you know, self-help certainly, and there's a good deal of that in there, but beyond that, into this whole idea of, you know, it's not a peculiarly World War II phenomenon. I think you need to get away from that and think about it in a much broader context.
Yeah, Bob, thanks very much. I really enjoyed your book, especially the sections in which you discuss how organized crime networks help Jews. So we have to be thankful to the mafia for rescuing Jews, especially in Spain, for example, Italy. My question is rather unorthodox. As somebody who works on the Armenian case, of course, we also where the co-publication is. One of the puzzling phenomena I've always kind of grappled with is the phenomenon of coincidence, sheer luck, dumb coincidence. And I've seen so much of it that actually, I would say at least half of all the cases of rescue or survival, there's incredible amounts of coincidence, sheer luck. Somebody looks the wrong way, somebody falls out of a train, complete coincidence. But of course the problem is, can we analyze coincidence? Is this as a phenomenon analyzable? Do we have any examples of sheer coincidence? Is it analyzable, and if so, how? Just something to think about.
Yeah, I was hoping you were going to go down the criminal route there, but that's a shame. Never mind. All right.
You can pick that up as well.
No. It's I don't. I've got something I'm going to use this afternoon. So this is a commercial for this afternoon. If you can turn up, it's a story there. Okay. The problem with what you're talking about is that the only way that we know about the coincidences and about the luck is by and large from survivors. We don't know what happened to those people who did not survive. Now, I know there are exceptions to that, but they are very few and far between. So we only have one side of the story. It's probably reasonable to suppose that most people in hiding had a number of narrow escapes, either perceived or real. We can't judge how dangerous individual situations were. But there is no doubt that because, if you're trying to exist underground, you are under constant threat. And your levels of paranoia will be increased anyway. So there's a sense in which people will come out of this experience with a narrative that they have of their own survival. Now, can we judge that in terms of some objective truth? Probably not. We have to just take it at face value and try and evaluate it against a series of other similar stories. If we can interrogate, I don't know, 50 or 100 people in a similar situation, or in the case of Chris Browning, 156 of them, admittedly not testimonies that he collected, but that other people had gone, to get some sense of what the risks were, what the situation was, how do we establish some objectivity about what was going on, to our own satisfaction and maybe to the satisfaction of our readers. I don't know. I think you're right. I think there is a huge element of luck involved in this, which you can't calibrate, you can't make any sense out of. And there's no way of saying that in 1942 that there were a series of right choices that individuals could make which would make their survival likely and certainly not guarantee it. People made choices on the basis of all sorts of strange and sometimes counterintuitively. But through some Byzantine route they come out the other end. But I don't think you can argue that there are specific right answers. One exception, maybe. Those people who successfully managed to escape from Nazi-occupied Europe obviously had a much better chance of long-term survival. That may sound obvious, but the risks involved in doing it were that much greater at the time. So in other words, once you're on the run, you're on the run. You're then being sought by the authorities. So it's almost counterintuitive to say it's easier to stay put because nothing's really happening at the minute and we can stay here for long enough. And then all of a sudden the roof caves in. Those people who made that decision to move at an early stage probably, statistically at least, had a better chance of survival. If you're a Dutch Jew, you've got a better chance of survival if you've pitched up in southern France than Jews who stayed put in Amsterdam. But it's statistics, it's no more than that. I'm trying to think of other exceptions. I'm sure there are some. But you are talking about, degrees, if you like, and degrees of threat. I suppose an example of that would be of Jews in mixed marriages, who in most countries are never under the same threat as their wholly Jewish contemporaries. But they cannot possibly know that. I mean, yeah, they are protected by legislation in the short term, but what you see over time is slowly but surely all those protections being knocked away. Yeah, because the Nazi occupation ends before the Nazis get around to rounding up all these people and causing trouble by so doing, they survive. But there's no objective means of knowing that would happen in advance.
Well, this leads us logically to the question that has been a lot discussed last years. What did they know? And of course, Jews and non-Jews, what did they know? What would happen if? And then, well, there are all these circumstances, but especially this, of course, what would happen when we are going to be deported to the East. And as you know, a couple of months ago, a Dutch book appeared, the book of Bart van der Boom, and it was did special research based on diaries, and it came to a conclusion. And I don't want to discuss a book that is not here on the table, but I'm just going to ask you, how important do you think the answer of to this question is for your topic?
It has a potential to be very important. The problem is, I'm not sure you can come up with an answer. Even in the context of contemporary documents and diaries written at the time, I'm probably a natural pessimist. And therefore when I write things down, I always look for worst case scenarios. And I'm sure there are plenty of people around who were doing that at the time too. They may well write down things, looking at the worst possible outcomes of whatever happened. Whether they actually believe that, or just writing them down saying anything that happens is going to be better than this is much better. I think there are dangers in trying to extrapolate back, even in written sources, to exactly what people are thinking against what they write down. What do they know? When did they know it? Well, leaving aside the heuristic elements of can you actually know these things anyway? Potentially, as I said at the very beginning, it's quite important in terms of evaluating rescuer behaviour, or trying to evaluate it. But whether we can ever get to the bottom of that, I don't know. I suspect, as in most things, that the conclusion, I haven't read Bart van der Boom's book, I think what will happen is that there is a great deal more collective knowledge about what is likely to happen than people would confess to later on, because it's easier to say, oh no, we didn't know anything about that. Whether that makes a difference to their behaviour at the time, whether it makes a difference to us as historians trying to evaluate people's actions, I think is another matter. So I was struck by something that came out of that. Of course, one of the main protagonists in that whole debate is David Cohen. Because he continued to argue, even in the post-war era, that they did not know, or the leading members of the Yalta did not know what deportation really meant. Now, whether it's a construction or whether it's a reality, I don't know, but he wrote, I have a letter that he wrote to James MacDonald, who had been the Commissioner for Refugees in the mid-1930s, claiming exactly that in 1953. They continued down that line of saying we did not know for certain what, and that's trying to extract back from something which obviously in the post-war era became very obvious what had happened. But but again, how much can we trust that? Is that a consistent line that Cohen had all the way through? I don't know. And these are the sort of questions that probably should make your brains hurt. I try not to make my brain hurt too much. But.
Can I elaborate on your question? Because when we ask ourselves, what did people know, we assume that had they known, they would have acted differently. They would have helped more. But I've also found it as an argument not to do anything, considering the Jews as a lost case. Would you agree with that?
I think there's probably a wider context to that. I think it's something which I was reading a little more about. And it's an argument that one of my former colleagues, Ian Kershaw, has put forward in relation to Germany, namely that what you actually are examining here is not necessarily an antipathy towards the Jews, but merely indifference. They're not quite like us, and therefore we don't really have anything to do with them. It's to portray that as anti-Semitism, maybe pushing it too far. What it is just indifference. Indifference to people who are sort of part of the generality, but not really part of our community. And it may that may of itself be enough to limit the amount of intervention there might be to help, helping strangers effectively. That's a thing in its own right, if you like. And some cultures are more sort of attuned to it than others. I was struck by something, and it's certainly not my idea, but Bert-Jan Flim, when he wrote his book on the rescue of Jewish children, he highlighted the fact that there were parts of the Netherlands where there was this culture of that you would always help people travelling. This idea of people who were on the move, moving between one place and another, that there would always be help available to them. It was part of that sort of hospitality, but people in need would always be helped, because these were in isolated communities where people had to be self-sufficient. It comes back to the same agricultural community saying, you know, if somebody's barn burns down, everybody turns up to rebuild it for them. You know, it's that sort of idea. But that's if you like, an agricultural and a localised phenomenon, which you wouldn't find in places like Amsterdam or Rotterdam or whatever, because you're talking about entirely different urban environments where people live close together, but actually maybe separated more. In those are culturally separated, merely by virtue of the fact they can live separate lives even when they're living much closer together. That sounds dangerously sociological, but I think there's a case for that. But you're right. I mean, there's no guarantee that just because you know more, you're going to be more active, because all sorts of other factors come into play. If you know more about what's happening to Jews, you may also know more about what the penalties are for helping them, or think you know more about them. And that again, you may have completely countervailing forces that will encourage you to do exactly what you would have done anyway, because you know, more knowledge on both sides merely just balances it out.
Well, Bob, I think this is a good moment to finish this informal discussion, and I hope, like you said before, that this will be a commercial for attending the lecture this afternoon on 15:30 in the aula here, and then you can hear the whole story and the parts that Bob kept secret up to now. Well, thank you very much for your very open and enthusiastic way you stimulated our interest and discussion, and we hope you see you again after this afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you.